Hi, and welcome to our second section of Module 5. Here we're going to talk about business models. Most of you will be familiar with the topic in one way or another. I'll just provide a quick run-through so that we established kind of a common language. It's also a section that you want to consider very closely for your final project. The main point here is that we talked about technology, we talked about innovation, but we also want to think about the commercialization and the monetization part. And so business models is kind of an important section to think about and discuss. Now, most of you have seen some kind of definitions of business models, seen in the popular media. I've taken classes where professors discuss business models. Most of the times, what people usually mean with business models is revenue or monetization models, but it's a lot more than that, right? And there's essentially three key components to it. The first one is the one that we typically talk about, which is the economic model. The second one is the architectural configuration, and that relates to what we discussed in terms of core competencies and core rigidities and dynamic capabilities of a firm. Your internal processes, how are your internal processes aligned to create the value that you're proposing. And so you can imagine as firms become more complex, you'll have more complex and intertwined business models. And then lastly, you have strategy, right? So we have you have my architecture of the firm, I have my economic model. How do these align to improve and optimize my strategy, right? And vice versa. What is my strategy of the firm? And how does my strategy of the firm align with current business models? If I have to change my strategy, right? Market conditions change, just the way things operate change. I will have to change my business model as well. So then in terms of the components, we have about 6 components. The first one is how does a firm create value, right? So that's related to the offering that you have as a company. In this case, if you offer a specific innovation or specific new technology, there are some specific values related to that. Technological standalone value, right? We talked about this, and next network externalities, et cetera, et cetera. What is the source of the firm's competitive advantage? Who do they create value for? How do they differentiate themselves? How do they make money? And what are the time, scope, and size ambitions? Especially the last part is really important for entrepreneurial firms versus large firms, right? So what do I want to do, right? Do I want to license my technology? Do I want to launch or create a company, right? If we think about Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, et cetera, they use and leverage, either developed and or leverage technology to scale their business model, right? So any of you who ever watched Shark Tank, the word scaling is being uttered in every second sentence. And technology companies tend to be scalable, right? That's why venture capitalists are liking them so much, is because they use the technology to reach out to many different people and kind of monetize their infrastructure or their system over a broad set of customer segments. Often they're also mentioned together, but business plan is more of a formal document that typically and should ideally have a description of the business model in them. It provides a background and financial information about the company, outlines the goal for the business and steps to attain these goals. It can be very detailed, right? If any of you has ever read a business plan, they can be pretty deep, right? So that's just kind of a formalization, and typically business plans are read by institutional investors, right? Now, we have what's called, or what we consider, standard business models Again, the word standard here is relative, right? 20 years ago, Google's and Facebook's advertising business models didn't really exist, right? So it's not been that long. We have what's called an auction business model, bricks and clicks, franchise, freemium, low cost, et cetera, et cetera. You can find all kinds of categorizations. Really, what's most important here is to look at what are the components of these business models, how well are they aligned, where do they create value, et cetera, et cetera. Now, disruption is typically a word used in the context of technology and innovation. But actually, what we find historically is that business model innovations, so to speak, are a lot more disruptive, right? And you can use historical examples like Dell, Google, Salesforce, Uber. Think about how Google has revolutionized the ad market. Yes, they built a search engine that was very powerful, that was technologically advanced, probably not the most advanced in the market at the time, but they had a great intuition of how they're going to monetize it, right? And one of the important outcomes here was that if you look at advertising, right, newspapers, TV, et cetera, typically they're not really very well targeted, right? And so targeting ads became incredibly more powerful with digital technologies, right? And the internet, of course. Think about Facebook and Google, and the effectiveness of these targets has also been debated, right? So we use the word manipulation in many cases, but these have become very, very powerful, right? And so that's essentially a technology-enabled business innovation. Salesforce, and the interesting thing here, and there's a lot of companies who do something similar, is utilizes what's called software as a service. I'm sure you've heard about it. You might have worked for a company that does that. But the idea, and most of you might remember, we used to install software on the computer, whether it's on floppy disks or on CDs or DVDs. But now what we've seen is that most software is enabled through the cloud, and that has some advantages and also some disadvantages. One of the big advantages is that you don't have a lot of upfront cost, especially when you have very expensive software. One of the disadvantages is that once you don't pay the subscription anymore, you don't have access to that software, and that can become quite tricky actually for businesses. Uber, most of you might have taken an Uber or a Lyft. That was quite disruptive, right? The idea that it doesn't seem to be that, technologically advanced. It was a mobile app, right? All you would do is kind of order a driver or a taxi, so to speak, through an app. But in addition to that, of course, they're also leveraging people's cars, right? So there's two really powerful parts to this business model. One, of course, is the technology-enabled part, which is that you can track your drivers, you can look for pricing, et cetera, online. But the more interesting part is actually they're using people's property, right, as well, cars that we consider to be non-monetizable assets, right, for the consumer suddenly became monetizable. Right, so essentially you could make money off owning a car and providing a service, and that was actually quite a lot of people are doing that to make money in different states and different circumstances. So that's quite interesting. And of course, we have Airbnb as another example of this kind of business model, technology-enabled business model. And so, so business models with great business models with great technologies are a incredible combination, right? And so we have to really think about that. Now, let's talk about that, provide like a little bit of an example. What you see here is what's called a business model canvas. Some of you might have seen it again in other classes, maybe a marketing class. maybe a management class. Here I'm kind of demonstrating it using Netflix as an example. And, you know, when you fill in these different kind of boxes, you can kind of think about that in terms of how to provide an overview of the business model of the company, right? So what's the value proposition of Netflix? One of them is you have streaming access, right? When we think about Netflix originally, the value proposition was that I could order DVDs from home, right? And they would deliver them. That was the value proposition. Back in those days, Blockbuster was kind of the place where you would have to go to kind of borrow or loan your DVDs and videos. Netflix offered that as a service to consumers so they can essentially deliver these things through a website or through the phone. Later on, when they added streaming, this became even more disruptive, right? But you could also kind of look at recommendations. You could cancel any time. You could watch Netflix and non-Netflix shows. Again, in the beginning, Netflix wasn't a content creator, right? That came later as they needed to differentiate their business model a little bit more because using other firms' content became slowly a competitive disadvantage because these companies who owned that content could pull that content eventually, and that would put Netflix, create a problem for Netflix, right? That's why we've seen essentially the transition to becoming a film studio rather than a medium, a place where you can loan entertainment media. Again, we can think about this from different perspectives, but typically, if we think about customer relationships, it's, you know, interesting, right? You typically don't have a store. Netflix doesn't have a store. You go on the website, you kind of set up most of the stuff. If you have some issues, you do either online live chat. I'm not sure they have a number, but they might actually. So I'm sure that you can probably call them. There's a 1-800 number, and then you have social media and other types of relationships. Interesting thing, right, is also customers develop a relationship with the company through their content, right? We've seen this with Disney. So Disney, whether it's Mickey Mouse, Star Wars, what else do they do? A Marvel, right? They create a customer relationship with through the content, right? And Netflix wanted to do the same thing, right? That's why they started to produce their own shows and kind of see if they can create these kind of connections. Again, they don't distribute. I mean, it's a streaming service, right? So they typically advertise it through all kinds of channels, but they have their own website and that's their distribution, right? They don't sell unless they sell some of their content through DVDs. They essentially just are they are their own distributor. And yeah, customer segments becomes quite interesting in Netflix, and it's strongly connected to the type of content you're watching, right? Whether you're a science fiction fan, whether you like true crime, and through their data that they receive through that streaming platform, they can actually target and develop content and have that in the past. But what we've seen is that their own produced shows also have some issues, right? They want to focus on stronger franchises, customers that kind of like a certain well-known shows, rather than produce a lot of shows for a small set of people. So that has also changed a little bit. Again, revenue streams, monthly subscriptions, they haven't really been aggressively licensing their own original content. That will happen in the future. In addition, we also now seen a couple of, when was it announced? I want to say a month ago, that they'll also have ads in some of their basic plans that will lead to a lower cost in the subscription, but those ad-generated revenues will help them with their overall profitability, or so they hope. Cost structure, what are they mostly paying for? Used to be DVDs and mail-related shipping costs. That component is very small right now. But certainly the cost of content production has gone up rapidly. And I'll show that I'll show some statistics here pretty soon. They have to build out their infrastructure, so they have to pay for that as well. They do some R&D in terms of their search algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. But so you see, right, back when Netflix was kind of the market leader by far, they didn't, but their investments in new content were relatively low. We've seen that new content now reaches about, I think it's $10 billion roughly. That's a lot of money, right, to produce new content, and that content better be successful because you're spending a lot of money on this, and so you need to figure out, whether that content reaches the audience that you're targeting. Now we've seen new players, we've seen Amazon, but generally speaking, everybody who's invested in streaming also builds original content because it helps customers stay in your platform. And also keep in mind, right, when we think about business models, Netflix is exclusively a streaming provider. Amazon uses streaming to tie customers to their platform, right? So it's a little bit of a different strategy, but still both of them invest tremendously. We've seen Disney Plus, might have a statistic here coming up, but if you look at Disney Plus, has been a massive subscriber success, right? In the last 4 years, we've seen some massive increases there. Disney has very powerful original content, right? The Marvel movies, Star Wars, etc. So they do a lot of that stuff. And you see, so 2019, this is not Netflix's quarterly cash spending. I think that has gone up now beyond $10 billion. It's quite an expense, right? And so they have to really be very strategic about that content, and if that content creates enough value. These are some shows you can imagine. There's some outdated, well, not outdated, but some shows. I mean, it's hard to really keep track here on the new shows, but back then these are some kind of statistics. There's a metric that's called average demand expressions. And you have to keep that in mind when we think about streaming companies. They had to develop a set of new metrics that go beyond what TV channels typically use to see if people are watching their content. And there's all kinds of other statistics, right? They know how many minutes you spend on a show. They know where you stop the show, right? At what point people lose interest, and they can track it up to the minute. They essentially they now know how many shows are downloaded on mobile phones. They can see if their shows more popular on mobile phones than they are on TVs, on desktops. You've seen that must have been months ago, because Netflix was going through a bit of a economic restructuring. They still have enough money, but they're having to deal with some issues with respect to their profitability. But they want to crack down on password sharing and account sharing, right? A lot of you probably, including myself, we share our accounts with other people, whether it's kids or whether it's friends. And so that Netflix needs to realize that that's just costing them too much money. Again, so this was the business model canvas here. I showed that there's a bunch of components, and we'll talk about these in more detail in just a minute. But typically, in most of my classes, I focus on the yellow part, and given that if you selected option 1, right, where you kind of where you have flexibility on which technology you're going to look at, I don't expect you to have a full set of revenue streams and cost structures. You just don't know enough about the technology to really develop a whole business plan and business model. But I do want you to think a little bit about some of those components here, whether it's value propositions, customer relationships, customer segments, where you're going to distribute your technology and how you're going to distribute it, what could be potential revenue streams. If you selected option 2, then you should have typically enough information to fill out a fair part of the business model canvas, if you so want to use that for that part of the analysis. Now, I'll give you some examples. I'll talk a little bit about kind of some core parts of the business model canvas. Here's what we call a value proposition, okay? And these are some questions you want to think about. What value do we deliver to the customer? Which one of our customers' problems are we helping to solve? What bundles of products and services are we offering? Which customer needs are we satisfying, right? And you can find all kinds of other questions. And again, here are some components. Value propositions can be about newness, they can be about customization, they can be about price, they can be about risk reduction. And you see there's a variety of examples here. I don't need to read off the slide, you can look at it yourself. But suffice it to say that the value proposition is a very core part of your business model, right? Whether you use a business model, whether you want to use the business model canvas as a framework or not, it's really important to understand that, right? Like, what are we actually doing and why are we doing this? Are we solving particular problems, needs? Which segments are we targeting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we talked about customer segments in our 4th module, and this is just a kind of a brief classifications of what kind of customer segments you can target. Again, typically, right? So if you're a small entrepreneurial firm, you typically don't target the mass market, okay? There are exceptions to that, of course, right? Think about Facebook, right? But even Facebook started on college campuses and then started to target more broader customer segments. Typically, you start with niche markets, right? And then you expand to your customer segments. And multi-sided platforms, all of us have operated them, have seen those operate. Amazon, for example, right? Targets or offers a business model, essentially offers this platform for both their consumer as well as the provider of the products, right? So they have to manage both sides. And in managing both sides, there are different types of economic opportunities. Other multi-sided platforms that we've seen that kind of older credit cards, right? Credit card firms have a consumer side, but they also have a provider or a business side to them. Now, the customer relationships are kind of important. We can see these become relevant when we want to retain, when we want to target, and we want to monetize certain relationships, right? You can use different examples. You have McDonald's. So let's take McDonald's, for example. What kind of customer relationship do they building, right? You have some kind of personal assistance, right? When you go and buy something, you have some self-service stations now that help you select these things. You have a drive-through, for example. You have all kinds of PR. So remember, I don't know if they do that anymore, but they used to have these children's play. They used to have these places where these playgrounds, right, where children can play, and so they can draw the parents there and kind of make them or draw them to eat. They used to organize children's birthday parties, etc., etc. So customer relationships are important and are indicative of what kind of segments and what kind of business model you're operating, right? And what we've seen in technology-driven companies is most of these are transactional relationships, right? Whether that's I'm going to buy something on Amazon, right? That starts as a transactional relationship, but as you build more components to your platform, it becomes a much closer kind of personal relationship with Amazon, right? Just the way of how what certain expectations you have of what the platform should or shouldn't do for you. And then if those expectations aren't met, you actually have some really kind of more emotional connections to some of these things. Okay, revenue streams, and you can imagine there's a lot more options here. And you can mix these different things, right? You have licensing, brokerage fees, asset sales, subscription fees, lending, renting, leasing, usage fees, etc. Anything you can think of, there is a revenue stream, potential revenue stream for it. And really depends how you align that with the overall structure of your business model. Here are, and this is kind of important, if we think about resources, right? We haven't yet talked about intellectual property that much. That will come up in the upcoming modules. But think about, right, we have patents and copyrights and brands and proprietary knowledge, customer databases. These are important resources for us, right? And when we talked about inimitable resources, they could be providing us with a sustainable competitive advantage, right? So that's why it's important to keep that in mind. Think about Twitter. You've seen kind of the various controversies about the Twitter platform. Now that Elon Musk has bought it, he decided to let a few people go from Twitter, and not only Twitter, Google, Meta, Amazon, et cetera. We see tech companies, they fight for talent, right? They need kind of software engineers, people who can develop complex products and maintain them. But they also realize that there's some capacity and they need to kind of cut overhead, like other non-technology driven companies as well. Here, the main differentiation really is between fixed and variable costs, right? So you have heard about these. Kind of the main point here is, am I a fixed cost or a variable cost driven business? Typically, you mix both. But Amazon, for example, has a fair amount of fixed costs, right? They have a big infrastructure that they are trying to maintain, and they leverage that infrastructure to offer a variety of services and products to a large amount of customers. When you start out as a small firm, you typically want to build up more variable costs, right? Because that means you can exit quicker. Think about service. Think about software as a service, right? We talked about that. So if I can sign up for an expensive software, try it out, just pay a smaller subscription fee, that kind of helps me to save my upfront, to reduce my upfront bill, and build that business up or scale that business first, and then kind of see where things are heading. Economies of scale, economies of scope, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about some of these things already. Again, I don't expect you to be an expert in business models. Okay, this class is about technology and innovation, but it is an important component, and we have to think a little bit about how these two things intersect. I'll talk a little bit about some typical business revenue models here in this case. So all of you have heard of freemium, right? And we've seen what we call the freemium business model kind of emerge in all kinds of places. Technology companies have taken advantage of that. If any of you uses Spotify, for example, there is a free Spotify, right? That has a lot of the options that you're interested in to listen to on a free basis. Although nothing is really free, right? They're using your data. They do find a way to monetize your data. But what typically happens is that they do a basic free package, and then they sell you premium things, right? So if you want to do certain more things on Spotify, you'd have to pay for it. And that it's a model that's been operated by quite a few companies like that. Flickr, I don't know if you have used Flickr before. That's kind of an example where we have kind of the limited basic account. Okay, you can do some photo sharing there on that website. But at the same time, if you want to do more advanced stuff, or you want to share a certain amount of photos, or you want to do something with them, you have to subscribe to the Pro account. And that's pretty common. That's a pretty common strategy. Similarly, Red Hat Linux, I don't know if any of you have worked with Linux before. That's per se a free software, right? So Linux is a free operating system. However, if you want to have a customized Linux for your company, you typically pay to one of these providers, one of which is Red Hat Linux. And what they'll do is they take the free software package, but they customize it to your needs, right? And by doing so, they essentially monetize that. And that's been a pretty good model. There's a fair amount of companies that use Linux, some in different parts of the enterprise, but that model has been interesting and quite successful in terms of figuring out how you're gonna develop kind of the software of your enterprise or government organizations. Okay. Skype. Obviously, we know now that Skype has been a bit. Skype is not the Skype that we used to. Back in those days, Skype was a huge market leader. They were sold to Microsoft for quite a large price. Turns out it was probably not the best, or the best return on investment for Microsoft. And you've seen that there's a lot of companies who do voice over IP, and including Facebook, right? If you want to call people through Messenger. And the basic idea of any of these VoIP companies was that you offer a free internet and video calling with other people who use that service, right? So Skype users are calling each other for free. If you want to call landlines, though, you buying a minute package, or maybe you have a subscription. And so that's the way how VoIP companies typically monetize. I know that if you've ever used Viber, that's also another provider. They also sell stickers, which is funny for their messaging. So there's all kinds of ways you can commercialize, or you can kind of monetize your technology platform, right? So you just have to think a little bit about that. What kind of consumers you have, what are they willing to pay for, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what we call bait and hook, okay, business models. We've seen these in a variety of versions, okay. We used to see cell phones. Now cell phone companies, there's also a lot of change in the marketplace there. I don't know, maybe have you used Mint, or I use Tello, where you don't need, big contractual lock-ins anymore. You pay month by month. And they have pretty competitive pricing, and you have unlimited data, or et cetera, et cetera. So they have some really good pricing models. I used to be a prepaid guy. I don't know if any of you has ever used prepaid. When I first came to the US, that was a while ago, I'd say 2005. I used a AT&T prepaid. I think it was like $25 for 3 months or something. And you would pay literally for every incoming call and every message that goes out. And then you can buy some messaging packages, et cetera. So it was kind of a strange way to think about that. And now, I signed up with Tello. I think it's a $10 a month unlimited call and text with, I think, 1 gigabyte of data. And there's all kinds of escalations, right? But the main point was that back in those days, cell phone companies would use subsidized smartphones or cell phones to get people to get these subscriptions or these contracts, right? To pay for these contracts. And so that what's called a bait and hook business model. And we've seen these in various versions. And feel free, to look at the business model canvas here closer. Razor blades is a pretty common bait and hook business model, right? They typically offer the handle with one blade for free, or not for free, for a very cheap price. And then the replacement blades are more expensive. We've seen options. There's been some subscription models around razor blades. I'd have to remember the name of these, but you can look that up online. And so what they used to do is they'll send you a certain amount of blades every month, and you'll pay some kind of subscription. And if you're shaving a lot, then that's a pretty good deal. If you're not shave a lot, then typically people, kind of overpay a little bit for these subscriptions. But again, there's different types of business models, right? If we think about razor blades as a technology, how do I monetize this technology? There's different versions for this, right? And so it's important to kind of think and tinker and find the right business model that you can use to do that. Another example, and that's a freemium business model, is I don't know if any of you has ever done some skiing. I personally don't do a lot of skiing. But if you decide to go skiing somewhere in the mountains, right, and you happen to have an accident, then there are these kind of insurance or, they work on a subscription or on a membership fee. And what happens is essentially, if you have an accident and they have to get a helicopter to take you away, to kind of pick you up, you as a member, you pay close to nothing. But if you're not a member, these things can get pretty expensive. They're like 5,000 to 10,000 euros to transport somebody with a helicopter out of a situation like that. So again, different ways how we handle and monetize different things. I love business models. Business models is really, for me, was always a core part of business schools, right? If you don't understand business models, you have a hard time understanding how you monetize technology, right? So it's really important to think about these. Okay, and a couple of some brief discussions on revenue models. Again, how you kind of sale, what kind of revenue you generate depends on kind of how your business model is aligned. Typically, what we're used to is kind of selling units or selling assets, right? You sell, I don't know, smartphones, you sell computers, et cetera. You have a certain amount of units that you need to sell. You sell cars, right? Remember, we talked about early on how cars, as they become more autonomous, will also lead to a different business model, right? So car companies will kind of pay for, they're going to offer subscriptions, meaning that you can use the car, which is kind of what leasing is in a way, right? It's kind of a version of it. But you'd have car companies essentially selling their cars, not per model, but through a subscription service. Again, we talked about the razor and razor blade model and the printers and ink model. That we have the same kind of bait and hook business model there. Yeah, franchise revenue model. We haven't talked much about that, and it's typically not super relevant in the technology and innovation space. But again, all of us kind of know McDonald's, Subway, 7-Eleven. So there's some advantages and disadvantages that come with using a franchise. We talked about advertisement revenue briefly. This is becoming more interesting now. We have what's called a data revenue model, right? And so there's a lot of companies that try to monetize data and think about how we can actually use customer data and kind of generate revenue from it. There is also plenty of ethics issues coming from that, right? What type of data do you sell? Should you actually inform your customers, et cetera, et cetera? All of us have probably signed pages in terms of conditions without really reading through a lot of the data agreements. But yeah, these are some things that certainly will become more regulated in the future. intermediation revenue models. Again, we have brokerage fees, right? We have this in the analog economy as well as the digital economy. Think about eBay, think about real estate brokers, think about credit card companies, right? So there's all kinds of types of companies that have engaged in the intermediation revenue model. Licensing, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about intellectual property. And we see a lot of that in the NFL, MLB, or NHL, how we kind of license certain content or technologies to it. Subscription, again, we have, that has become a pretty common way of how we monetize now at different types of businesses. You can use subscription revenue models to kind of outmaneuver competitors, right? We've seen this with that's what I was looking for, is the Dollar Shaving Club. Some of you might have heard about that. That has kind of changed or adjusted their business model to kind of take some market share away from Gillette, and there have been some lawsuits and counter lawsuits. But the idea is you can use subscriptions, right, as Netflix has used against Blockbuster, as a competitive advantage. And that has worked surprisingly well in the last 10, 20 years. Okay, and kind of we have consultants, lawyers, and accountants. Again, you also see this professional revenue model in the digital world, right? Whether that's a freelancer or Elance or Fiverr. If anybody has used that before, you can do this, you can digitize that pretty effectively, and people can kind of sell their services and their skills online. And that has been quite successful. Again, when we talk about business models and how we kind of tweak them to be successful, think about Gillette versus Dollar Shave Club, Netflix versus Blockbuster versus Redbox, and many more, right? So the ability to tweak business models, even though you're doing effectively the same thing as your competitor, right? Let's say your value proposition is kind of similar. You can adjust other parts of your business model to create a competitive advantage against them. Okay, here are some examples of what we call a copycat or cloned business model, right? And I don't know if you're very familiar with that company. It's called Rocket Internet. It's located in Germany. And what they typically do is they look at successful businesses in the US and they just clone them, right? And we've seen this in other countries as well. You're looking at what the US does in some areas and you clone their business models or the type of businesses. And then hopefully you're successful with those. All right, and so that finishes our section on business models, and the next and last section will be on timing.